So I suggest, in the interest of time, I'm sure people will be joining, but I'm going to get going. So firstly, for those of you who don't know me, I am Vanessa Ballally. I am co-chair of Gender Networks, which is part of the wider We Are the City group. Do you just want to say hello, Birgit? Introduce yourself. You're on mute.
I thought I clicked it. I'm Birgit New. I am co-chair of Gender Networks with Vanessa, and I have a side gig as a senior DEI advisor, but super happy to be here and very excited about today's event. Packed agenda and lots of great stuff. So Vanessa, I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you. So I'm just going to quickly share my screen. Just bear with me a second. So hopefully everyone can see my slides. Birgit, if you just give me a nod, and then that way I know that everyone can see them. So again, a warm welcome to you, and welcome to our Q4 meetup for Gender Networks. We've just introduced ourselves. Obviously, I'm Vanessa Ballally, and you've just met Birgit as well, and we're co-chairs for the Gender Networks. So our agenda today, a little bit of a welcome from us. I'm going to give you some updates as well on your membership. We've also got a member speed network. So fingers crossed it works. We're going to put you all into virtual rooms and I'll explain to you what you're going to do there. So a really good opportunity for you to meet other chairs and build your networks and relationships. We've got a fantastic host spotlight with a long-term Gender Networks members from NatWest. So with Lisa and Zena. We've got the wonderful Harriet Minter with us, who's going to give us the skinny on what's in the news in terms of gender. We've got an update on the FTSE Women Leaders Review, which will be a fireside chat between Vivian Arts and Birgit. Really interesting segment on the post-election employment law landscape. There is so much going on here that we need to know about, and we're very grateful that Naomi Sansom has joined us from EY to kind of give us a rundown on what we should expect and the impact of some of that. We then have Eleanor Mills, the wonderful Eleanor Mills. She's the ex-Sunday Times editor-in-chief, who's recently written a book, much more to come, and she runs an organisation called Noon as well for kind of over 50 women. So Eleanor's going to tell us a little bit more about the book and some of the stuff that she's doing and just pick up some highlights. So a real bumper-packed meeting. This meeting is being recorded, so that obviously you can play it back thereafter. So there we go. So in terms of who's joining us today, and some of you may have joined a little bit later, so hopefully it's up to date, but a warm welcome to all of these different companies and some of our guests as well who are joining us for the first time. So a little bit of an update from me. We reviewed what we currently offer you in terms of your membership of Gender Networks and felt that we could do a little bit more. Things have massively changed since we set up 14 years ago. And I think networks have changed in terms of their maturity. So we were thinking, how can we add kind of more value to what you get for your annual membership? So here's some of the things that we're going to be doing, which are new. So you already get the 4 quarterly meetups. And it's been really interesting coming out of kind of lockdown and stuff where, you know, prior to lockdown, we would have rooms of 100, 150 of you in the room. And obviously we've seen that landscape change with people working hybrid. So we still have our 4 meetings. We'll have 2 virtual and 2 in person. And I'd really encourage you to come to the in-person ones because that's where the kind of magic happens, and the little speed network that I'm going to do with you in a second can actually happen in person. So that doesn't change. You'll still get them. But what we've added on is this ability to invite your entire Gender Network committee. So previously we said your membership encompassed 4 different licenses where 4 people could come and join. But actually we think that it would be much better attended if you opened up the invite to all of your committees, your chairs and your sub-leads and things like that. So the 4 members thing has disappeared. The next thing is the ability to invite other ERG leaders within your organisation. So, for example, some of the things that we're covering on today's meeting, such as the changes in employment law, will be relevant to your ethnicity networks. They might be relevant to your LGBTQ network. So we're opening it up so that you can invite other ERG members to join you if you feel the topic is relevant. We still have the Gender Networks annual survey report. We've moved that from the end of the year. We found it really hard to get everyone's attention in December to complete that. So we're shoving that kind of a little bit back into next year. One of the things that we're adding, which I think is a real value add, is 3 virtual events per year. So on the We Are the City side, obviously we do lots of different career growth events and stuff for our other communities. But we thought what we would do is we'd do 3 virtual events. So these will be with keynote speakers. They'll be on career development topics. They could be with authors or stuff like that, and they'll be open to you, but all of your network members as well. So we can have up to like 10,000 people on our Teams account. We can also live stream that for those of you that don't have Teams. But this is something that you can build those virtual events into your existing schedule of events that you're running next year. So we've probably got more ability to bring you a very expensive speaker, so we can kind of cover the cost of that, but you guys can benefit from it. So we will be contacting you with what those topics are likely to be and some of the speakers, but also we want to hear from you. What do you think in terms of value add to your network members would be the topics that you would like us to cover? So again, you can open them up to all of your networks, so saving you money. Drop-in sessions outside of the quarterly meetings to share best practice. Sometimes on these quarterly meetings, we don't get enough time to actually deep dive some of the topics in your network. So we'll be proposing some of them. They'll just be drop-in sessions. So it's up to you if you attend. But ideally, we'd kind of be looking for someone who's done something, it's gone really, really well, and they want to kind of share that best practice. A WhatsApp group. We use this for a lot of our different communities across We Are the City, from our Rising Star winners right the way through to some of our other kind of the communities and groups. But it just gives you a place where you can share or ask questions. We can put reports on there, TED Talks, or anything that we think that might be of interest to you. So there will be a WhatsApp group link that you can join. And again, we can chat. It'll be invite only, so it'll just be the Gender Networks members. We're also going to establish, we had this before, but people didn't use it, so we're going to try and bring it back, a LinkedIn group, again, just so that you can connect members. Again, a place for us to share videos, must-read reports, and things like that. And also because Be a Git and I see across the landscape of gender, it's just a place for us to pop stuff on that, you know, top items that you should be aware of. We're rebuilding the website and the logo, and we're having a complete rebrand, and the members portal that we know and love today will disappear and a new one will come in its place. But all we'll be using the member portal for is to host the recordings of the meetings. We want to do more of these member profiles, so Leona will be reaching out to you. So just a little editorial piece on a little bit about your network, you know, what event you're most proud of, where's your direction. So just those snapshots that we can share with other members as well. And then finally, just some more regular bulletins, again, containing those reports and things like that. So 3 places we're trying to hit you in terms of extra and additional resource from the WhatsApp group. If that doesn't work for you, you'll have it on the LinkedIn profile, and you'll also have it in the regular bulletins. So bringing, we haven't changed the price. We know that budgets are very always tight from a Gender Network perspective, but we hope that we can give you kind of more value for your money. So more will be coming out of that. Hopefully we'll have the website built over the next couple of weeks. You'll see all the new branding. And again, the way that you can help us, if you meet other Gender Network leaders, please do point them in our direction. And I know a number of you already do that for us, but it'll be great as we can kind of continue to grow our community. So that is hopefully a nice little gift at the end of the year. Bear with me a second. Just something I want to mention, obviously on the We Are the City side, many of you saw we had an incredible Women in Tech Week, the first one of its kind, 70 events, thousands of women across the country, which was incredible. We've got a few other things on the boil celebrating our Tech Women 100. I've got an amazing list coming out where we've shone a spotlight on 20 women in a particular industry. You'll see that coming out as well, and we'll be celebrating them in December. But the next big thing, I think, for you guys to look out for is the Rising Star Awards. So nominations open in January. There'll be 20 different industry categories. If anyone's interested in sponsoring a category, do get in touch and I can send you a pack. The thing is about Rising Stars is we don't just give, you know, an object and have a dinner. There's a whole development program in place for the winners of that, of those awards. So, you know, from Days at Warwick, again, they're WhatsApp groups, 1 to 10 calls, and next year's Rising Stars will also get to present at a leadership conference that we're doing mid-year as well. So do look out for that. No age limits to enter those awards, no cost involved, really easy to nominate someone, and we get the core information we need from the actual individual. So keep your eyes open for that one as well. Right, so that's enough from me. So let's connect. So this is the part where we're going to put you all into different rooms. What I'd like you to do is to introduce yourself, company, where you sit in terms of your gender network. So what's your roles and responsibilities? You may want to talk about, what you've been up to this month or what you've seen within your companies. So bear in mind, we have Black History Month. It's also been ADHD Awareness Month. It's also been Breast Cancer Awareness Month as well. So are you doing any events for them? We're going to put you into these rooms for 10 minutes to enable you to meet each other. And then obviously you'll see the sign when we're going to call you all back in. I think I'm just going to keep you on one rotation because depending on how many of you there are, I don't want to bring you back in 5 minutes and cut you short. So we're going to press the button now and enjoy your conversations, and we look forward to seeing you back in 10 minutes. Leona, can you put everyone into their rooms, please?
Bear with me.
Okay.
We've tested this. It should be working. Pip, are you there?
I am indeed.
Are you able to open the rooms?
Just bear with us one sec.
Bear with me. It's not allowing me to open the rooms I've assigned.
All right, look, if you just work on it, we will move on to the next segment. So, but please give us notice because somebody could be in the middle of a conversation and we'll all disappear.
We all do.
Into rooms. We've got to love the technology, right?
This is tried and tested as well. So
I know,
bear
no
with.
worries. Lisa and Zena, I don't know if you want to kick into your session now.
We can. I love the agility of that, like flexing in the moment. And obviously, if we all suddenly disappear, then we can all come back together afterwards. But yeah, I think Zena is just introduced herself in the chat. Hopefully she'll come off mute as well. But just by way of introduction, I'm Lisa Ardley Price. I'm a managing legal counsel here at NatWest. I've been here for nearly 10 years now. And I'm also one of the global co-chairs of our gender network, which I'm going to be introducing to you shortly. Some of you, may well already be familiar with. We've been members of gender networks for some time now, and we've worked very closely with We Are the City. So thank you for inviting us along today. My colleague Zena is here as well to present a spotlight on one specific area that we've been focusing on this year, which is women's safety. And Zena, do you want to introduce yourself briefly?
Yes, thanks Lisa, and apologies, I can't seem to get my video working, although you can see two nice enough pictures of me, although I did put makeup on today to work from home, which feels like a bit of a waste. But I'm a performance and business management manager for data and analytics, and I'm also the co-lead for the communications and marketing committee in the NatWest Group Gender Network as well. And as Lisa said, I'm here to present specifically on women's safety, which I've been taking a lead on for the last couple of years. So looking forward to doing that today.
Fantastic. So here's our slide deck. We're going to first start out by kind of introducing you to the NatWest Group Gender Network and telling you a little bit more about us, who we are, how we're structured, and what we do within the bank. So within the bank, within the group globally, we've got about 8 different employee-led networks. We are one of them. We are the largest. We've got about 9,000 members and around about 350 volunteers, although it's difficult to keep track of them all and people move in and out, but that's kind of roughly the numbers for you. We've got 3 co-chairs on a global basis. So we've got myself, I'm London based. We've got Bethany Henderson, who's based up in Scotland. And we've also got our colleague Vikas Goel, who is based in India. So we really are a global network. That wasn't necessarily intentional that we have the co-chairs in all those different locations. We used to have 3 co-chairs in London, but it's very fortuitous that we now have that kind of multi-regional spread, because it ensures that we're all able to stay very well connected to our different regions globally. And within that, we're also structured throughout the network with regions and strands. So I think we've got a graphic that demonstrates that shortly. We'll come to that in a moment. Within the leadership team, we've got a number of different subcommittees. So we'll walk you through those now. So we have a team that supports communications and marketing. I'm not going to go through all of the details of the of what the specific teams do. That's all on the slides here, and I think they'll be shared with you afterwards. But Zena, who's on the call now, works within that team. She co-leads it with one of our colleagues, Cassie Keys, and they're really, responsible for getting our newsletters out, promoting all of our events, our internal and external communications and marketing. Then we've got an operations team that's led by Boo and Laura, and they really make sure that we keep running on a really kind of efficient model. They make sure that we do all of our LTs. We have those on a bi-weekly basis. And any other sessions and things that we're running, they make sure they're set up. They make sure the whole network runs like a really well-oiled machine. Like, I don't know what we would do without our ops teams. And they have a lot of different processes that they put into place. Like, we get a lot of members and volunteers coming to us wanting to run events. So we have to have a really consistent events process to make sure that the events and the initiatives that we are running fit firmly within kind of our mission and our focus as a network. We have our initiatives and partnerships team, which is headed up by Lauren and Suzanne. Within that, I've just seen someone flick up in the chat and say, I Am Remarkable. Within that, we've got I Am Remarkable, Lean In, a huge number of initiatives within Lean In. We've also got 50 Ways to Fight Bias, Allyship at Work. They're responsible for all of these different initiatives and partnerships that we have and that we run across the bank, and just fantastic. We had a call yesterday actually on Lean In, and we spoke directly to Sheryl Sandberg, who was this morning sending us an email telling us what a great job we'd done with Lean In. So what a wonderful thing to wake up to this morning, message from Sheryl Sandberg herself. Lifestyle and policy, so they're really focused on gender specific lifestyle and policy issues. There's a lot of well-being stuff that goes on there, both for men and women, all genders. That's headed up by Ashley Calderwood and Charlotte Mills. They really helped to drive through our partner lead policy, which launched at the beginning of last year and has been hugely successful. So they really kind of helped to drive that through, and they're looking at a number of other things which I'll talk you through shortly. Next slide, please. So a couple of other subcommittees that we've got within our leadership team. We've got a career development team, which is headed up by Debbie Hoskins and Samantha Brand. They have been responsible for our flagship development program, which is a completely volunteer-led development program for our junior colleagues. It's now in its 10th year, so we're very pleased to be celebrating the 10th year of that program now. It runs on a global scale. We have over 100 colleagues that go through that program each year, and they're all supported by colleagues who volunteered their time to not only run the program but also to come in and help coach those colleagues through the program. And that is really aimed at kind of fixing that broken rung that's been identified, women not getting into their first management positions because of a lack of confidence, or maybe their skill set. So helping them to build the confidence, predominantly because we know women have got the skills. It's not the women that are broken, it's the system. So helping them to then navigate the system, to get connected, to create that confidence within them that they need to then be able to push themselves outside of their comfort zones and go for those roles. It's been hugely successful, again, as I say, 10 years now. We're also now starting to look at kind of other areas of career development that we can help with as a network. So one of the things that we're looking at is more kind of development at the senior end as well, to help prevent that glass cliff that some of us may be familiar with or will have heard of before. So women getting all the way up to the top and then not being supported properly at the top. What can we do to better support them as a network? Then we have our regions and strands, which I spoke about previously. So Victoria Hartnell and Leslie Shield, they coordinate all of the regions and strands. It's a big task. As I said, we've got over kind of 350 volunteers globally, and the regions are really kind of, as you would expect, they're different regions within the UK, but we also have Poland, we have APAC, we have India, we have the US as well. And then for strands, they're very specific subdivisions of the gender network where we know there are particular kind of pockets of the organisation that need a bit more support. So for example, women in tech or women in markets. We also have a wealth gender network. We have a women in treasury network as well. So just those areas where we know they need a little bit more kind of specific help and support in their particular areas. And then we have allied men. So Allied Men is our kind of allyship and male advocacy committee within the Gender Network. That's headed up by Millie Batchelor, Glenn Exton and Caroline Dobbs. And we're really proud of Allied Men and we're really proud of everything they've done. Next month is obviously International Men's Day. We've got an abundance of activities that are happening for International Men's Day, one of which is happening at the end of this month, so we're starting early. But we did circulate details of that to all of Gender Networks, and I hope you come along to it. It's an event that we're doing in conjunction with TestHim, and it's about raising awareness around male fertility. And we'll have Toby Trice coming along, Porsche racing car driver, to talk about his personal journey with infertility, leaning into that theme for International Men's Day, which is role models. So really exciting work that Allied Men do. And I think, you know, a real journey that we've been on as a network, having kind of previously been, you know, very much kind of a female focused network. In fact, I think at one point we were actually called Focus Women, but now we are the Gender Network. And Allied Men is also kind of been through its own evolution. It wasn't one time male allies, but we saw the importance of supporting our male colleagues with male advocacy as well as driving that allyship. And we actually think that makes them much better allies to us. It really kind of brings them into the conversation if we can actually spend time understanding their issues and challenges, as well as those that women face in the workplace, so that we can kind of better understand each other and really kind of drive gender equality together. Next slide, please. Okay, so our impact framework. So we spent a lot of time last year thinking about how we could really, you know, make the most of the resource that we've got within our network. And I'm sure this is a challenge that resonates with a lot of you, in that, you know, we're all volunteering time off the side of our desks. You know, we're not getting paid for this. We're all deeply passionate about it. So how do we make sure that we have the most impact with what we've got? So we spent a great amount of time doing a bit of a retro, looking back at like how we've run in the past, what we've achieved, what's gone well, and actually kind of where are the pain points and what do we need to do differently going forwards. And it felt a little bit like at times, you know, there was so much drive to run events, run initiatives, like do everything, that it was a little bit like throwing paint at the wall and seeing what sticks. So we thought, let's try and be more purposeful with what we're going after. So we have our overarching organizational purpose as a bank, which is to champion potential, helping people, families and businesses to thrive. And very much what we do as a gender network sits within that organizational purpose. And our real kind of North Star here is to make sure that everyone within our workplace is able to thrive regardless of gender. Okay. And we're really focused on, you know, pushing towards gender equality. And so we came up with 3 pillars under which we would seek to achieve this. The first there is allyship and intersectionality. The second there is career and personal development. And the third there is gender-specific lifestyle and well-being. So some of them align with some of the subcommittees that we've got within the leadership team, although it wasn't necessarily directly intended that way. And obviously all of this activity runs across all of the different committees we have. So there'll be things that our initiatives and partnerships team do that do sit in all of these different pillars. There'll be things that Allied Men do, for example, which obviously sits within allyship, but also will touch on career and personal development and lifestyle specific, gender specific lifestyle and well-being too. But really that was just to ensure that we had like a one-pager in front of us that would hold us accountable to any activity that we're trying to run with, to say, does it fit within this? Does it fit within these parameters? If it does, fantastic, then that's really going to help us to achieve our North Star. If it doesn't, then kind of question whether that's the best use of our time or whether we could be doing something more effective. Next slide, please. So I've really done like a whistle-stop tour through most of that. I'm keen to make sure that Zena gets enough airtime on women's safety, but I will just pause there momentarily and see if anyone's got any questions about anything I've just described, or any questions about issues, challenges, things that we faced as a network, and how we've solved for those. Or we can come to it at the end.
Has anybody got any questions for Lisa? Lisa, I've just got to say, while people are asking their questions, what an incredible network you run. The way that you're structured and some of the events that you've been doing, absolutely incredible. So just hats off and kudos to your team. So I think Akua, have you got a question? Do you want to come on camera?
Yeah, I just wanted to say that it's so impressive. And it was just, Stephen, this last slide that you've that it's on at the moment, especially with White Ribbon, because that kind of helps teach young boys and men like kind of how to behave in terms of the workplace and things like that. And I definitely think it's so impressive and it's so important at the moment. And I just wanted to say thank you for sharing, because it gave me food for thought as well for our network. So thank you.
Fantastic.
Oh, thank you, Akua. And nice to see you as well. And I think, on that, I think that's exactly why we're together on calls like this, right? Bringing all these gender networks together. We're here to collaborate. This isn't competition, right? No one wins a prize for getting here fastest. So if there are things that we can share with you that are going to help you and your networks and vice versa, that's the whole point of having a forum and a safe space like this. So thank you. And yeah, happy to kind of take it offline and have a chat about any of this. Any other questions before?
Susan,
yeah?
I think Susan's got a hand up.
Just coming off mute. I did drop a question in Q&A, and you did cover this already in a little bit of detail, but I'd just be really interested in finding out a little bit more about kind of your rebrand for the gender networks, particularly on allied men. And for context, we've had quite a lot of discussion about how we label it. And we all know there's been a lot of evolving discussions around DE&I over recent years. So I'd just love to hear a little bit about what drove your decisions to have that rebrand.
Yeah, and to be honest, it predates my involvement in the leadership team. We did it a couple of years ago now. About 3 years ago, we went through that rebrand, and it was very very considerately thought through, I suppose. I think what we were noticing is that we just weren't hitting the mark in terms of allyship. We were trying to bring more men in as allies. We're trying to encourage more people into our events of all genders, and it just wasn't happening. And so we looked at it critically and said, like, how can we do things differently? What do we need to be looking at here? And that's where that kind of male advocacy piece came in. So off the back of that, then kind of shifting from male allies to allied men, and then running events not just around allyship, but also about raising awareness of male issues too. So, prime example is the one that I've shared with Gender Networks, which is the Test Him event we're doing on male infertility. We also have had hugely successful events within the network that we've run for raising awareness around menopause, specifically for our kind of male colleagues. And International Men's Day last year was hugely well received. We did a lot. The theme that year was around kind of no male suicide, and so we did a lot around men's health and men's mental health. And off the back of that as well, we've launched kind of male health circles, which have been hugely popular as well. And it's about giving men that safe space as well. So I think we know that we want to bring everyone together to have conversations, but I think there are also there is still a need for kind of specific spaces for different genders to come together as well, where they can have that psychological safety to kind of be really open and honest with one another, and then bringing everybody together, in those more intersectional spaces where we can have those open dialogues. So I think that there are different needs to be met, and it's we've not necessarily nailed it yet. We are also continuously going through an evolution. We're taking on feedback from our members. We're listening to what we're hearing across the bank and also externally around how we can potentially change things up and do things differently, and how we need to also change and evolve over time as well. So but happy to chat through that in more detail and kind of share with you some of our lessons learned. If you like, please don't hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so much to both of you for covering that. And I think if anyone's else on any other networks that have gone through that rebrand, do pop some stuff into the chat as well, as we're talking around, you know, your experience of that, what your drivers were for that, has it been successful? Because that has been an ongoing conversation for a number of years as well. So thank you very much, Lisa. Really, really appreciate you sharing. And also, as ever, the offer to help others, because that's kind of what we're about. So I don't know if you want to quickly cover this off.
Yeah, so we're gonna talk about, Zina's just going to talk about women's safety briefly and do a spotlight on that, and just to contextualize it. One of the things that we've been looking at as a network, amidst also having our pillars, is looking at some of the big things that we're really going to go after. So I mentioned partner leave was something that we threw a lot of resource at previously, lobbying for, and so we thought, well, what else are we going to really push and lobby for? And one of those big topics for us is women's safety, and this is a real hot topic right now with, you know, in November it's 16 days of activism. So Zina's going to talk you through a little bit about that and some of the things we're doing for that, which might inspire some of the activities that you want to run yourselves, or you may already be thinking about this. But just to go back one slide, Zina, do you want to just give an overview of what we're thinking about and what we're currently doing in terms of women's safety?
Yeah, of course. Thanks, Lisa. So we kind of touched on this a bit already in Lisa's breakdown of the strategy that we have. So women's safety feeds into the gender specific lifestyle and well-being strand of our strategy. And I suppose the force behind that, I mean, it's pure data. You know, and I've pulled a few figures off Women's Aid. I'm sure we don't necessarily need these, but just to kind of call out, I suppose, that on average every 40 seconds in 2023, police recorded a domestic abuse offence, and just under 20% of women who have experienced partner abuse in the last 12 months have reported that to the police. So a lot of that statistical analysis, but then also the lived experience that we have through some of our members and colleagues across the bank has really drove this agenda in the last couple of years, where it's really lifted off. So in terms of what we've done so far, one of the biggest things is setting up some women's safety support cafes. So these run on a monthly basis. They're anonymous to join. It's up to you whether you share name, etc., whether you come off mute, whether you share your story. But these have been going on now since about April. We've got maybe about 12 turning up on a regular basis, and we have people kind of dip in and out as and when maybe they feel like they have had an issue that's come back up for etc., or something has been in the news and they want to talk about that in a safe space. And some of the feedback there has been really powerful on just bringing together women with those experiences to talk them through, and we're continuing to do that as well and ramping that up as part of the 16 days campaign as well. Some other key call outs that we've done is we've had some panel events as well, and we also did the 16 days campaign last year where I think someone pointed out we worked with White Ribbon on that. This year we're also working with He for She as well, so we're really making sure that that allyship is in there. As Lisa said, Allied Men is a really important strand for the gender network, so we really want to get men on board in this conversation. And we've also got an event planned with an ex-Police Scotland officer to come in and talk about what does it mean to be a male ally in this space of violence towards women and girls. We've also got another event which is called Hear Our Stories, Domestic Abuse, Harassment and Stalking. In that event we have 3 committee members, myself being one of them, and we're going to speak through our respective experiences of those 3, mine being domestic abuse, and have a bit of a Q&A on that. We've done some similar events before, but this one's going to be much more conversational and then drawing out those common threads and almost doing a playback of what a cafe can be as well, to kind of a live audience to try and get that engagement in our women's safety support cafes. And as you can see, we've got a couple of those coming up post the event that we're really hoping we can push people to come to and start to share and start to have those conversations too. And we'll also be doing some Glitch online safety workshops as well, one around protecting women online and one about protecting children as well. The other bit that was on the previous slide was just around kind of where we see this going, and I really want to touch on that while we're in this group. As Lisa said, it's really important we're getting together across all the gender networks, and I see some of that feeding into our vision for the future as well. So a part of that is trying to bring together, you know, a community of practice across the banking and finance space on domestic abuse awareness, and trying to really ramp that up in this space as well. And also things around allyship as well. How do we create allies against domestic abuse in workspaces? So trusted people that you can go to disclose, to get advice, etc., to point you in the right direction as well, when maybe that doesn't feel like it's going to be your direct line manager. And so those are some key things I wanted to call out. If anyone wants to pick up offline, more than happy, but conscious of time, so I'll pass back to you, Vanessa.
Thanks so much, Zena. And again, just another wealth of incredible events and engagement from NatWest. So thank you so much. So moving on to Harriet. Harriet, good news, bad news in your headlines?
I mean, it's not as bad as it has been, so that's delightful. So lovely to be here with you as always. Just a few little interesting nuggets, I think, this week. Vanessa said I'm going to bring you the skinny on the news, which I'm excited by. Nobody's ever asked me to bring that particular requirement ever in my life, so I'm very excited about that. So McKinsey Women in the Workplace 2024, it's their annual report. They've been doing it for 10 years now. This one in particular kind of looked at something I thought was quite interesting, which is not just the senior women, which is where they usually look, but also at entry level. And I think I certainly had a belief, which was that we'd kind of sorted out gender equality at entry level. In fact, that maybe women were even doing better. And what this report actually shows is that that's not the case. Entry-level men are still more likely to get their first job earlier than women, and also they're more likely to get that first promotion earlier than women. So some interesting stats to look at there. I wasn't sure whether I'd put the Deloitte Women at Work in my last one or not, so in fairness to Deloitte, I didn't want to leave them out. This is really interesting on women's health, both mental and physical, and the impact that has on our working relationships and how we feel about work. Lovely bit in here about flexibility. If you really, really want to gain competitive advantage over your competitors, the key is to encourage all your competitors to demand back in the office 5 days a week. The number one reason that women have changed jobs in the last year is for greater flexibility. FTSE 350 women on boards representation drops. This is what happens when we all get a bit self-congratulatory and think we've got something sorted and we don't need to keep looking at it. We do need to keep looking at it. Otherwise, everybody goes, ta-da, we've got one woman, therefore we have no problems. This is the first time in 8 years that it's actually dropped. So just something to be aware of there, that if we don't keep talking about this, people take their eye off the ball. Why are there so few women leading the UK's biggest companies? Why? Why indeed? I have thoughts, but most of them are also in this article. Trigger warning, it does contain the line, is it due to women's confidence? It's not. That's not what it's about. It is in the article. One day we will be able to write an article about female promotions without asking that question. But it does also look at some of the kind of more endemic reasons and perhaps some of the subtler reasons that we don't tend to promote women into those leading roles. One thing that's really interesting is we like people from finance backgrounds. Women are less likely to do finance degrees. So we are just going to punish women for 20 years of really great working practice by saying, yeah, but you don't have a finance degree, so we're not going to let you have the top job. Women's health tech is less likely to get funding if a woman is on the founding team. The irony that we are happier to give money to a man to tell women how to manage their health than we are to someone with lived experience of it. Okay. Also, on that irony, Smashing the Girl Boss Myths, Women and Ambition. This is a great article from The Guardian on a book entitled The Lady Macbeth Syndrome, Women and Ambition. Who do we think wrote the book? Who do we think wrote the book? A man. But it is a really funny book on women and ambition, and it's a really great article on how our response and attitudes to women's ambition is changing. I thought this was really interesting. There's new research out showing that flat hierarchies can actually discourage female applicants. I think traditionally we might have thought that a flat hierarchy brought in more women because it wasn't that kind of typically masculine top-down approach. But of course, what we actually know is that when you have a completely flat hierarchy, nobody listens to the women. Sometimes we need a nice, strong job title so that we can tell people what to do. And finally, this is from the Harvard Business Review about how anxiety shapes men and women's leadership differently. We often think that lack of confidence or anxiety around work is a female problem. It's not. It shows up for men just as much, but it shows up in different ways. You've probably guessed it. For women, it shows up as flight, so we will ignore the problem. We will try not to have the confrontational conversation. And for men, it shows up as fight. So when a man is shouting at you, he just has social anxiety. But we should take that into account, be aware of everybody's needs and how they're responding, and be able to have a more open conversation about how we're all feeling in the workplace. I have to run off. I'm so sorry I'm going to another meeting, but it's been so lovely to be with you here. Thank you so much.
No worries. Thank you so much, Harriet. So those links will be in the pack. Birgit, I'm going to hand over to you.
Amazing. Thank you so much. And always great to see the latest in the news. And I am going to invite Vivian Arts to join us on screen. If she's not already there, because I can't see her. Vivian, either. Oh, you're there. Excellent. Good. It's just me then that can't see you. Well, anyway, I'm delighted to be joined by Vivian Arts, OBE. For those of you who don't know Vivian, she is the CEO of the FTSE Women Leaders Review, which is the UK's business-led voluntary framework to help improve the representation of women on boards and leadership teams of the FTSE 350. So back to what Harriet was just talking about. And also it's now including 50 of the UK's largest private companies. But that's not the only thing that Vivian does. She has many skills, lots of experience. She has lots of expert advisory roles supporting businesses in things like data privacy and digital strategies as well. And very importantly, Vivian also has an enormous amount of experience with networks. And actually, that's where I wanted to start with our fireside chat today, Vivian, is to talk a little bit, given the fact that our audience here, we've got lots of people running gender networks who are all extremely passionate network leaders who, like many of us over time, have run networks off the side of the desks, might be struggling a bit for time and recognition in terms of the work that they do. So could you just tell us a little bit about the roles that you've had with networks along the way, and just share a little bit with the audience about the benefits of running networks to you? What has that meant for you personally, just as a bit of inspiration to keep everybody going?
Thanks so much, Birgit. And Vanessa, hi, lovely to see you again. I'll be honest, the last time I was at this meeting was when it was in person, and it's in its old format. I don't know how many years ago, when I was the co-chair of the City Women's Network at Citibank. So it's so lovely to see that this network is still going so strong. And I have to say, it was such a fantastic opportunity to connect with other people from other networks, to learn from others, and also to do a bit of internal benchmarking, which is super. So pleased to be back, and in a different form, but still hugely connected and supportive of networks and this lovely network of networks. So networks and sort of where I've come from, well, gosh, I've been in financial services for all of my career. Started off as a lawyer, and when I went to Citibank, I became involved with the City Women's Network. Not initially, but over time, I thought I wanted to get more involved because I just wanted to give back to women coming up the pipeline, because I realized the further I was getting, actually, the fewer women that there were. And so I joined the City Women's Network, and then I had the opportunity to put myself forward to be one of the co-chairs, which I did, and became co-chair of the City Women Network. And the timing was rather lovely because Jane Fraser happened to be the head of the private bank at the time, and she was just transforming the private bank into a place that people wanted to work, but more importantly, from the bank's perspective, into a profitable business. And so I had the opportunity to work with Jane Fraser, who's now the CEO of Citibank, on our annual International Women's Day event. And we pivoted the network at that stage, I mean, this is a while ago, away from just events and stuff, which was getting people together to talk about the problem. And instead what we did, I mean, which is important, but I think we've done that long enough, and I think we got a pretty good idea of what a lot of the problem is. It evolves, but you know, the basics, we know what they are. Right. And we've changed that to So what's the business case here? Why is this important? And how do we engage with clients? And actually, how do we bring them in on board? And that's when we started working with the business and with the business leaders to create International Women's Day events that were totally client focused. And the men in the businesses were just flabbergasted with the number of women at senior levels in their client base that they just didn't even know existed. And we were able to find all of these women, and they were so pleased to come to a fantastic event. I remember we had Condoleezza Rice for one of them, we had Madeleine Albright for one of them. I mean, it was like we had superstars come, and everyone came out, and just the power of the network was hugely important. But it was one of those things you had to run it off the side of your desk, and it was when I was sort of coming to the end of my time as co-chair, I had the opportunity to apply to be the president of Women in Banking and Finance. And I remember when I was asked to, well, I was told I was successful in that application process, which was absolutely amazing. I did speak to my boss in New York, the man in New York, and he said to me, because I said, obviously, I need your permission to do this. And he said, well, provided it doesn't interfere with your day job. Now, I mean, okay, it was a while ago, but it was so typical. And I think that might still be a bit of a challenge. But what was fascinating is when I moved to a new firm, when I moved to Thomson Reuters, and then when it split off and I then went with Refinitiv, I told them I was coming with this president of Women in Banking and Finance role. And they were like, yeah, okay, that's good. And then when it became Refinitiv, I said to the leadership, I said, you do realize that this is just like fantastic. And this, to have one of your most senior women, who's also the gender champion for the organization in this role, and our clients are all financial services, how good this is. And they're like, oh, totally. So you just go and do what you want to do. And, we just think that is literally the halo effect, reflected glory, whatever you want to call it. But it was the first time I think I had seen the power of business actually embracing what we were doing from an ED&I perspective, particularly in relation to gender, recognizing the benefit, getting behind it and supporting it. And it was, I mean, I was on rocket fuel. It was fantastic as a result. And we were able to achieve so much having that positive engagement. The business won, Women in Banking and Finance won, everyone we were working with won. It was a win-win all the way around. So going back to your question, it's really hard to do this off the side of your desk when you don't have support. But when you do have support, it's transformational. And it isn't just transformational for you and the organization that you're supporting as chair, co-chair, whatever. It's transformational for the organization who is enabling you to do it. And it was just wonderful to work for an organization that absolutely got it and recognized the value of it, which was super.
That's brilliant to hear, and hopefully inspirational to those folks on the call who are still working off the side of the desk, to also think about how they engage with their organizations. The client focus that you had with Citi, I remember that very well, jealously as well back in the day. Let's move on to your current role with the FTSE Women Leaders Review. Now, obviously, you've just stepped in to the CEO role there, which is great to see, and so pleased to have you with all of your background in this role. So for those people on the call who might not be familiar with it, can you just give us a little bit of a background about the review itself and the journey that it's been on, and where are we today in terms of those stats?
Super, I'd love to. So I have to say, what a privilege to be CEO of the FTSE Women Leaders Review. My predecessor may be known to many of you, who's Denise Wilson. And the history of the review is that it started in 2011 with the Davies Review. Lord Davies did that study and basically came up, the request to government with the data on what is the representation of women on the boards of the FTSE 350. And the number was 9.5%. So women were 9.5% of board members on the FTSE 350, which clearly was not acceptable. So what happened was they then put the review in place. They put a target, which is 25%. They measured firms against it every year. They had to report against it. They published it. So it's all of that, it's the target, it's the transparency, it's the measuring it, it's the disclosure, and that produces accountability. So the review morphed from the Davies Review into the Hampton-Alexander Review, and then the targets were reset to 33% because progress was being made on the 25. And then in I think it was 2016 or 2019, it became the FTSE Women Leaders Review, which is what it is today. And the current target for women on boards and in leadership is 40%. So what's I think the most exciting thing is that at 9.5% in 2011, this year, with a target of 40% to be achieved by 2025, the FTSE 350 is actually at 42%, which is incredible. They've actually exceeded the target. But, and as was mentioned by our previous speaker, it is terrific to have made that progress, but you do have to start unpicking a little bit to understand exactly, so what does that mean? And the fact of the matter is that there are still some companies in the FTSE 350 who are below 33%, and then there are other companies that effectively are lifting up the data altogether. So where are we in terms of the review? So the review, we've got 13 years of data. We publish it every year. We've included 50 of the largest private companies in the UK as well. We've done a lot more detail in terms of the data. One of the things that I'm really keen to do as the CEO is to make sure that people read the report and use the data. The data is there to be used. It can tell you an awful lot. So although we don't collect much data, what we do with it is actually quite extensive, and we're able to offer some really, really interesting insights. So, what are some of those insights? Well, I've told you the board data has gone from 9.5 to 42%. At the executive level, which is the C-suite plus their direct reports, for the FTSE, it's at 34.5%. This year, we would have been collecting data from the 50 private companies for 3 years. So look at February 25th is when we're going to launch the report again this year. But at the moment, we're seeing amongst the 50 private companies, not as strong at the board level, 31%, but at the executive level, actually stronger, 36%, 36 compared to 34.5%. So super interesting. But the area that I think that we need a lot of work on is the executive level, because we're a long way off that target of 40%. But when you start unpicking the data, what's the difference between executive and non-executive roles? And the reality is that for NEDs, 48% of them are women. But when you get to executive directors, only 15%. And that's why we've been focusing on the review on not just the numbers, but also where are those numbers coming from? And so we've been looking at the 4 key roles in relation to the review as well. So we're looking at the chair, the CFO, the SID, and the CEO. And there we're finding, female CEOs only about 8% compared to a much higher number, about 20% in the 50 private companies. CFOs at 21%. Versus 24% in the private companies. Female chairs only at 13%, about similar, 12% in the private companies, and female SIDs at 47% compared to 56% in private companies. So it's interesting to see that the private companies are making a lot of progress, but a couple of trends, just so you know, FTSE 100 performs better than the FTSE 250. When you move down to the next tranche of the all share, it doesn't perform as well. We still have a number of all-male boards. If we look at the FTSE 350, we haven't had an all-male board since 2019. So the targets work, the reporting works. We've had consistent progress year on year. We've got 13 years of data to back that up. We're also focusing on, those 4 key roles and who's in them, because those are the roles that have impact and influence within the organization, impact and influence at the board, impact and influence at the executive level, and then also unpicking that NED versus executive director piece. We just don't have enough women in the executive director, and that's a pipeline issue. You're going to get to executive director if you're in that right role at the executive level, moving up. And so that's the pipeline that we need to work on. Happy to answer any other questions on that.
Yeah, I think the report itself every year is such a good read. It goes into so much detail, and as Vivian mentioned again, that the analysis of the data is really, really thorough. So I would encourage you all annually to have a look at that. And again, even though it is focused on those board and exec level roles, it is talking about some of the pipeline issues as well that should be relevant for all of your networks. And I guess, Vivian, my final question would really be about, based on the insights that you're seeing in the review and where the review is heading next, and also your own personal experience with the kinds of things that networks are actually really good at. Do you have any asks of the people on this call around where should they be focusing their actions now over the next sort of 12 to 18 months that can have real impact? And again, just that reminder, as you said, 25th of Feb is your launch of your next report. So make sure that that's in the diaries to keep an eye out for that. And also we'll be sharing that as soon as that's in hand.
Super, thank you. I suppose it's just one other thing I wanted to say is I know that certainly when I was at Women in Banking and Finance, one of the things we did was we actually focused on women at all stages of their career. The report here is focusing at board and leadership level for a couple of reasons, one of which is that at the board and leadership level, that's where you can effect change more quickly from the top down. The other thing is, of course, is that is where the gender pay gap is at its most extreme, is at the top level. So if we have any intention of making headway with regard to the gender pay gap, then we've got to get it at that executive level narrowed, and we have to have the women in the revenue generating roles at that executive level to make an impact in that space. But what can you do within your networks? I think that there's a real call there for you to engage with your business leaders. This isn't an ED&I and HR responsibility. This is a business responsibility. And I certainly found that through my time working in networks, is when you engage with the business leaders, both male and female, that's where you can effect change. Feed them the information, help them to navigate the space, help them to be the gender champions within the business, help them to understand why we have targets, the importance of meeting targets. Use your experience of your lived experience of all the women in your network. And when I say all the women in your network, we're obviously talking about not all women, and because we do know that some women face a harder challenge making progress in their career. For example, if you're disabled or if you're from an ethnic minority, the progress is much slower. So open their eyes to all women within the organization to progress them. And the other thing is, you know, one of the sectors that does pretty poorly is the tech sector. And it would be great to get more women in the tech sector. So I've always worked in data all my life. My degree is not in the sciences. I can barely fill in my tax return. But I've always worked with technology. And I think that's an area that we can sort of make a difference with. And then particularly in the area of AI. I mean, we need people who are able to contribute to the technology revolution that is changing our lives and our workplaces. And we need more women in that space to actually make the difference. Otherwise, the tech is being designed by men for men, and men of a particular demographic as well, because the men who are getting the funding from this tend to come from a certain demographic, and so it's not even inclusive to all men. So I think, you know, the more we can get involved in future-facing technologies, innovation, and new business areas, the more progress that we're able to make. And maybe that's something you can focus on in terms of your networks, is who's looking at these spaces, how are you influencing those spaces within your own organization?
That's absolutely brilliant. Vivian, thank you so much for joining us today. It's been amazing to have the Whistle Stop Tour. I have a feeling we might be calling you back at some point again to give us some more updates, but it's been fantastic. And thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. Bye-bye.
Thanks so much. Great. Well, next up, we have Naomi Sansom, and Naomi is an employment lawyer at EY. She is currently engaging with her clients on all this new legislation that's coming in, affecting both national and global businesses, such as the upcoming EU pay transparency regime, all these new changes that are coming in proposed by the new Labour government. So I'm just going to hand it straight over to Naomi to give us a bit of an update on what's going on. Naomi?
Great, thanks, Birgit. Excited to be here. This is a really great time to be an employment lawyer. I mean, I do say that all the time because I'm biased, but there's such a lot of change at the moment, which is driving better gender equality. We've got Labour's proposals, we've got new equal pay laws, and increased sexual harassment protection as well. So there's quite a lot going on for us to talk about. So can I ping on a couple of slides onto equal pay, please? Thank you. So the next judgment is something that you have probably all come across or read about in the papers. So this is the first in a long line of private sector cases across the retail sector around equal pay. And this was a huge claim. It was worth around £30 million. And I've put a bit of detail on equal pay law on the slide. But if we think about what this case was about, it was essentially about warehouse workers and retail assistants. So the warehouse workers were predominantly men and the retail assistants were predominantly women. So they weren't doing the same job, but the court found that they were doing work that was of equal value to the business. And the warehouse workers were being paid more. So the female retail assistants were bringing a claim for equal pay in the tribunal. And Next said, well, it's actually not really our fault because this is about external market forces. It just costs more to go out into the market and to hire a warehouse worker than it does to hire a retail assistant. And so we've just been paying on that basis, and it means that this group has paid more than this group. But the Employment Tribunal said, well, that doesn't actually work, and they upheld the women's equal pay claims. And this judgment is interesting because it attacks the foundation of that pay disparity. So historically, certain jobs are more male dominated and other jobs are more female dominated. But what this case says is that you can't rely on that historic pay disparity between those two groups to underpay the jobs that are female dominated, as long as you can establish that this is work of equal value. So this is quite an interesting shift in the way that the courts are looking at equal pay. And it is likely this judgment is going to be appealed, but the commentators talking about this are not particularly optimistic about next chances. So this could change, but it's looking like this decision is here to stay. And retail is just the beginning of this. There's a whole changing landscape around increasing pay transparency and other issues around pay, which brings me on to the next slide on EU Pay Transparency Directive. So this is obviously an EU law and it will be implemented across the EU member states by national legislation, which is in the pipeline. So you would be forgiven for wanting to switch up at this point and thinking, well, this doesn't really apply to the UK because, you know, we're not in the EU. But it's interesting because it signals a changing of the tide. Also, a lot of global businesses that I'm speaking to are planning a wider implementation of the directive and its principles across all of their global populations. And that's because if you do have a presence in the EU, it's going to be tricky to do a sort of partial implementation, especially if there's a mobile workforce or any kind of cross-border or international hiring. And also, in order to sort of show best practice with the changing landscape at the moment, a lot of businesses are keen to adopt these principles and show better transparency across the board, which is really encouraging. You might also have heard that it doesn't come into force until June 2026, so it's not a today problem. And I'll come back to that as I talk through the key points about pay transparency. And this is just about gender pay transparency, to be clear. So there's a lot of talk about things like ethnicity reporting, and disability pay reporting and gaps, but this directive is specifically about gender pay. So the purpose and the scope of this directive. So essentially, the European Commission looked at the existing regimes across the EU member states and decided that they weren't doing enough to close the gender pay gap. So at the moment, across the EU, there's an average of a 13% gender pay gap and a 26% pensions pay gap. And the European Commission said that transparency is really key to driving better pay parity. So that's how it came about. And there are three key things to think about in terms of what the directive does. The first one is around hiring practices. So what the directive is going to prohibit is anybody interviewing candidates for a job, they will not be allowed to ask the candidate what their current salary is. So obviously this is a bit of a cultural shift and a change in a way a lot of managers do their hiring and ask questions in interviews. And the purpose of this is to stop that historic pay parity, because if you've got both men and women applying for jobs and the women tend to be lower paid than the men, then when at interview stage, when they're talking about, you know, if you're allowed to ask them what their salary is, then you're more likely to make a lower offer to a woman, and then you're perpetuating that pay disparity. And that's the purpose behind the change in this hiring practice. But obviously, this is a bit of a cultural shift around, you know, different ways of asking questions and different ways of doing interviews, which is not going to come easily necessarily to a lot of hiring managers. So it takes time. So a lot of businesses are thinking, OK, well, 2026 is when the legislation comes in. But actually, are we not better off thinking about bringing that in, say, a year in advance, so that we've got time to, we've built in a bit of a buffer period to change hearts and minds before we get into trouble for actually getting this wrong. So that's hiring practices. The second one is employee information rights. So this is a little bit like our old friend, the data subject access request. So you might be aware of data subject access request, or DSARs as we like to call them, which is where an employee can ask for information, personal data, and the employer or the data holder has to give up that information. Well, this is the same sort of principle, but it's information around pay transparency. So your pay and the pay of people doing work, like work or work of equal value. So that's something that businesses would have to, these are the requests that businesses would have to respond to within 2 months. So businesses are scratching their heads around, well, how do you, store the data in a place that's accessible? So that's something to think about for businesses. And the third thing is the actual reporting obligation. So the directive says this is subject to threshold numbers of employees, so 250 employees per company. However, national legislation might actually make those thresholds lower. So we don't know yet because we don't have all of the detail, but we do know that there is going to be reporting across EU member states in respect of pay disparity, pay gaps. Now, if the pay gap is more than 5% and the company can't justify that, it's going to have to do something called a joint pay assessment. Now, a joint pay assessment is effectively a sort of negotiation with the local worker bodies, so things like works councils across each European member state. So anyone who's ever dealt with works councils in Europe will know that this is an incredibly painful task, and it's going to be very difficult for businesses to get through that without making significant changes to the pay gap. And it's really hopefully going to drive a lot of change in terms of pay. And I think this directive is going to be something which will make a huge shift in terms of gender pay gap across Europe. Another thing that businesses that we've talked about are thinking about doing is, again, like with the hiring, bringing this in a bit earlier to do a dry run, is to do the same thing with reporting. So again, obligation doesn't start until June 2026, but a lot of businesses will be thinking about doing a dry run the year before to make sure, to assess what that pay gap is, to rectify it or justify it if it's above 5%. And the penalties on this are quite significant. Again, this is another reason why I think the directive is going to be very effective. And it explains why this is really a board level issue. So this is the sort of thing that boards are going to be, or should certainly be thinking about, because the penalties for getting this wrong are very onerous. And the directive is very explicit about that. So even though national legislation, there's a bit of flexibility for each member state to implement the directive as it wishes, what they can't do is mess around too much with the penalties. So the directive has said they've got to have a deterrent effect. So it's likely to be something like percentage of turnover for businesses that get things wrong. So that's pay transparency. I'm going to move on next to sexual harassment and the new legislation around this. So again, it's great to see that we've got some legislation actually effectively safeguarding women. And this is extremely topical because it comes into force in 3 days, and it's going to bring in a new duty on employers to take reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment in the workplace, whereas previously this has been more of a reactive right.
Okay.
Has somebody got a question?
Let me know.
Oh, no, maybe not. Someone's just come off mute. So Labour is going to expand this duty to take reasonable steps, to take all reasonable steps. Now, I'm not going to go into the legalities and the differences between reasonable steps and all reasonable steps, because that's the very sort of thing that lawyers love to talk about and no one else finds remotely interesting, which I completely understand. But effectively, what Labour are doing is strengthening this duty. So it's going to put a pretty onerous obligation on employers to think about things like training when it comes to sexual harassment, updating policies, doing risk assessments, which the guidance has said are going to be critical to compliance with this new law. Businesses will have to think about reacting swiftly and effectively to complaints, even the sort of more informal ones. Businesses will be encouraged to have champions and have a proper speak up platform and things like that. The other thing to notice about this is that I've heard some rumours that there's a bit of a misconception that it might only be specific to certain sectors. That's not the case. This law applies to all employers who've got employees in the UK. So that's regardless of the size of the employer or the sector. It applies across the board. And this duty also includes a protection from harassment by third parties. So that would be customers, clients, cleaners who come in and clean the office, or caterers who work in the canteen. So it's a very wide duty and protects women in a very comprehensive way, or protects anybody who could be the victim of sexual harassment. And thinking about what happens if businesses get this wrong, well, if somebody is able to make a successful claim in the tribunal that's related to sexual harassment, they could have a 25% uplift in the amount of compensation that the tribunal might award. So you might look at that and think, well, financially, there's not a huge disincentive, but really the key here is the reputational damage of getting this wrong, which is obviously going to be quite significant for businesses. The other thing I think is quite interesting about the new law is that there's now an opportunity for EHRC, which is the Equality and Human Rights Commission, to take enforcement action following employee complaints. So if an employee potentially has witnessed sexual harassment in the workplace, or they've been subjected to it, but they don't really want to raise that internally within the business, and they don't want to raise a grievance, or perhaps they feel anxious about that, they can go to the EHRC and then have an investigation carried out that way. So it's just another avenue for people to raise the flag about sexual harassment, which is obviously a really positive thing. So any questions before I move on to Labour's changes? Done a bit of a whistle stop there on EU pay transparency and sexual harassment. I've got a couple more things to run through, but no, that's fine. Happy to take questions at the end. I'm just conscious. I'm conscious of time, and I want to whiz through things and get through everything that that I've got on the list. So as we know, new government have suggested all sorts of changes to the employment law landscape. We've now got draft legislation, which did come in within the 100 days that Labour promised. So these changes are likely to come into force either next year or the year after, because we start with draft legislation, then we'll have a consultation period which businesses will be able to input into. And then after that, the legislation is formally goes through Parliament and is becomes law. So first of all, we've talked about the first point. So this strengthening for all reasonable steps. So this existing law that's coming in 3 days, Labour is proposing to make that even more onerous on employers. There's going to be increased regulation around dismissal for pregnant women and new mothers. Family leavers and pay is going to be a day one right rather than there being a service requirement. And larger employers are going to have to publish equality action plans, gender pay action plans, and menopause action plans. So it's starting to push employers to think about these topics more proactively. And lastly, flexible working requests must be reasonably considered. And this has already been brought into law as a day one right. So again, employees can make these requests as soon as they start employment. And again, Harriet touched on this when she was talking about the Deloitte women at work, but it's women who are more likely to be working flexibly, making requests to work flexibly and moving jobs because of flexibility. So that's Labour's changes. So in terms of what can businesses be doing? So what can you be kind of encouraging leadership to do to help to bring about these changes and to help to drive forward the initiatives that they're thinking of? Well, around pay parity, I've put a couple of points on the slide. So it's about thinking about retraining, re-educating those hiring managers in the context of EU pay transparency, thinking about doing pay audits to justify pay differences or understanding the landscape of the pay disparity within the workforce so that the business can start thinking about the best way to rectify that and be compliant and also do right by its staff. Also think about comms strategies around all of that and consider how businesses would respond to that always on right. So that was the second point I talked about on the Pay Transparency Directive, the employee's right to information. So where do you keep the data? How do you keep it accessible and things like that? Also to think about reward frameworks for general compliance legally and promotion of equality. And then on sexual harassment, I probably should have put sexual harassment as the first point, actually, given that this is the more immediate topic for compliance. But risk assessments we know are going to be critical to compliance with the new law. So that's something that businesses should certainly think about doing. And there's some guidance about how to do a risk assessment online. Also things like refreshing policies and rolling out training and keeping that training up to date. So some businesses will do training, for example, as part of an induction. They won't think about refreshing that throughout the employee's life cycle. And obviously that's a pretty important thing to do. And as for Labour's changes, well, it's a bit of watch this space because we'll see how those proposals take shape, and what happens in the consultations. But there's quite a lot there, which is going to be is really going to touch on the gender agenda. So yes, that was a very swift run through. I've done about hour-long topics, hour-long talks on pay transparency and various other things. So I feel like I've run through that really fast, but I'm really happy to take any questions. And if you want, any more information on these topics, I mean, they're likely to be most relevant to your sort of HR, reward, DEI colleagues. So if you want to ask me any questions, or I've got some information and collateral I can share if it's helpful, if anyone wants to share that internally with their businesses, or anywhere else, I'm happy to take any questions, of course.
Fantastic.
Yeah, actually, I just wanted to jump in really quickly, Vanessa, on this. Is also just to say again, for those of us in the UK that have been dealing with the UK gender pay gap legislation, I mean, I don't know, Naomi, if we can kind of put a number on it, but this EU legislation is like the UK legislation times X. It's mammoth. It will require a huge amount of work, and I think there's a really great opportunity here for you as networks to think about how you're supporting the organization. I think even people who have all the will in the world to get this right, it's hard because there's so much to have to know and understand and think about, particularly for your hiring managers. So I think the role that networks can play in actually supporting the organization, to get this right and maximize the benefits of what this legislation is trying to achieve, it could be really, really powerful, especially if, as you mentioned, the global organizations may be rolling this out more broadly than just the EU, given how big and complex it is.
Yeah, it's absolutely huge. It's like the UK legislation times 10, really. And it involves various different parts of the business. So you're going to need to have HR, reward, legal, comms. You're going to have data specialists there as well to understand how to pull the data and do the analytics. So there's a lot that goes into compliance, which is why businesses are starting to think about this now, even though the legislation isn't going to become effective until 2026. We don't have that long, if you kind of work backwards from there and think through the to-do list on that journey to compliance.
And I think also for the fact that although some of you may not necessarily be in the role of implementation, as Birgit says, it's what does this mean to me in terms of the members of your network. So watch this space. I'm sure we'll have you back, Naomi, as we come towards that date. And obviously, as all of these laws continue to change. So a huge thank you. Maybe, Naomi, if you want to put your LinkedIn URL into the chat, if anyone else has got any further questions. Yeah, so appreciate we're running kind of out of time, but we've got enough time to hear from the wonderful Eleanor Mills. So Eleanor, are you with us?
I am here. Yeah, can you see me?
I can indeed. So Eleanor, if you could just tell us about your new book, yes, and also a little bit about the Noon community.
Absolutely. Hey, Vanessa, it's so lovely to see you. So this is my new book. It's called Much More to Come. I don't know if it's the wrong way around. See. Yeah, you can see. And so, yeah, gosh, where do I start on this? So I've known Vanessa for a long time because in my old existence, I was the editorial director of the Sunday Times, and we did a big campaign with We Are the City, and we really supported what you were doing with Rising Stars. And I've always been a great believer in women who kind of really mean it when it comes to gender stuff, and I know that Vanessa really does. And I was in my old gig, I was chair of Women in Journalism, I was the editor of the Sunday Times magazine, a columnist, all those kind of things. And I've always been passionate about equality, particularly around gender. Fascinating listening to you, Naomi, on what's coming down the pipe, because I think all of this stuff is really necessary. And my own story is that at 50, I'd worked for the Sunday Times for 25 years, and they brought in a new boss, and as happens to many what I call queenagers, women in midlife, I was suddenly out of a role. I was made redundant, and it was for me as if I had been pushed off a roof, my whole world had kind of it was like I died. Actually, I wrote an article for the Daily Mail in which I said I felt like I died, and it was really it was a real shock to the system. And I think that for many women, we see in the data that we've now since then collected and that I write about in my book, about how there is a massive midlife pivot, as I call it, waiting for many women, but it's not something that we really talk about or is discussed in the culture, or where there's really much of a kind of discussion about what that can be, what that can look like, or even really what's going on for women 45 plus. at work. And what my book, Much More to Come, is about rebooting your life. How do you change into something new in midlife? And as we all live for a much longer time, when many of us are likely to live the 100-year life, 50 is actually only halfway through. So we're going to have to get used to and comfortable with the idea that life shifts and changes, and that even if we've been doing something for 25 years, that doesn't necessarily mean that we're going to go on doing it for the next 25 years. And I'm all in favour of people really beginning to think about what those phases might look like, and maybe having a side hustle, or beginning to think about what might happen if you don't do the job that you've been doing for a very long time. And so what I did when I left the Sunday Times was I realised there was a huge hole in the market where women, kind of older women, weren't really being talked to in a way which is resonant for them now. I think the very names of some of the organisations that are supposed to represent us, things like Good Housekeeping or Woman and Home, are quite indicative of the fact that they're not really representing, say, a woman like me. I've always been the main breadwinner in my family. I've worked ever since I left university in 1992. And we are women who are in their kind of 45 plus, in their 50s, in their 60s. We're a really pioneering generation of women in the workplace. There haven't been women like us before. And the way that the media represents us is still very old-fashioned in terms of the stories that are told about us, or what companies expect from us, or how we're perceived. So my book, Much More to Come, is all about how I reinvented myself at 50. I was made redundant at 49, and I set up a community to actually finally answer Vanessa's question. I set up a community called noon.org.uk, because in the 100-year life, 50 is only halfway through, so it's only lunchtime. We're only at noon, and that is a community for women in midlife, which helps them pivot, helps them become the women that they always wanted to be at this point. I'm not sure. I'm just technically, I'm not sure whether you're seeing me as a kind of full screen or as a small head, or whether the slide is.
We're seeing you on. We're seeing the team can see both of you.
Okay, cool.
And my team have also put Noon in the chat and a link
brilliant.
to Amazon for the book.
Oh, you're there. They are superheroes. So really, I am trying to create a much more positive narrative about what's possible for women at this point. I think that a lot of the stories and things which are out there in the culture are not really very relevant to how we actually are, what we perceive ourselves as, what our lives are really like. And one of the things that I did when I first set up Noon was we did the biggest piece of work so far, biggest survey so far on women 45 plus and what they want from employers. And one of the things that I now do off the back of my book and as part of Noon is we go into companies to help them with the retention of older women. Because what we're seeing out of many companies is what we call a queenager brain drain. I coined a new phrase to talk about women at this point. Queenagers, like teenagers, but queens, because we are midlife queens living our best lives. And also in our focus groups, one of the women rather brilliantly said to me, I feel like a teenager, but in my own house with posh sheets and nice tea, which I thought was really good. And I've written, I've written headlines for many, many years. And so in my mind, this idea of midlife queens and the teenagers came together, and we got queenagers, which I think gives us a kind of good midlife rebranding. And what we know about queenagers is that we have always been the tip of the spear when it comes to change at work. So I'm really interested in Naomi's talking about the new legislation, because during my working career, and Vanessa's too, we have seen huge change, and it happened in real time. So when I had my first kid, I was allowed to take 5 months maternity leave, and by the time I had my second daughter, I was allowed to take a year. And that for me really sums up the kind of speed at which change has come, because of women, like us and the generation above us really pushing for change. So that first began with parental leave, then it's about flexibility. Now we've got kind of broader conversations about making the workforce more female shaped. I think for a lot of us queenagers, it was like we were given the lanyard, we were allowed into the building, and they told us that we had equality, but actually we were just being allowed into a completely man's world. And what I'm hoping that the gender pay gap legislation and stuff around, protections around menopause, etc., will do is make the workforce more, or the workplace more reflective of actually kind of what women need and what women want. And for me, one of the final pieces of the jigsaw is keeping older women in the game, that there's so much gendered ageism in the culture, and such a lack of understanding about women at this point, what we want from work, partly because there have never been women like us in these numbers in work before. We really are pioneers when it comes to that. And so in the same ways that we really drove workplace change around parental leave and flexibility, we're now having to really push for what we need for older women if we're going to stay in work. And given that none of us can claim a pension till we're 68, this massive queen-ager brain drain that we see in companies when women hit about 50 is really problematic. I was just at the Labour Party conference with Annalise Dodds, the chair of the, she's head of equalities and women for the Labour government. And they're really interested in this whole business of women stopping working or being pushed out of jobs at 50, because there's an enormous gender pension gap. We heard a bit about the gender pay gap. The gender pension gap is 35%. Women retire with 35% less in their pensions than men do. And we live longer. So if we don't keep women in companies between 50 and 68 to pay more into their pensions, we're going to have a lot of women with a very impecunious old age. And the government realised that that's a real problem. And there's an also huge benefit for the economy. If we just got back into work, the women who left during COVID, the midlife women who left during COVID, we'd add 7 billion to the UK economy. So these are big numbers. Amazing. And it's really important. And what we see, because we're working with, quite a few companies, including National Grid and Network Rail, and you go in and look at their figures and you can see this huge drop off. So things like for women aged between 45 and 50, they've got about 30% of the workforce is in that category. And then as soon as they hit 50, it goes down to something like 18%. So there's a real challenge here to keep queen-agers working. And although the stuff around menopause, I think, is helpful in some ways, because we all want health equality. And there was a really interesting piece of news earlier this week showing that women of colour were half as likely to get HRT as posh white women. And that's a real thing around. There's an intersection there between, your class and your race and all those kind of things. So we definitely need doctors. Yeah.
Sorry, we may get cut off because we're running out of time in terms of this meeting. So I think, just in case it cuts off, you're welcome to dial back in. I'm hoping it's not going to.
I've edited it, so I'm hoping it won't.
Thank you. Sorry. I mean, Eleanor, the point is, right, as you said earlier on, we're missing a complete trick, right, in terms of nurturing that talent pool. And when you think about it, a lot of the seniority is within, what Vivian was talking about earlier on about getting more women in those exec positions, they tend to be the plus 50 women, right?
Yeah, so, well, the average age of a female CEO is 56. The average age of a female chairman is 61. So if you have this massive queen-ager brain drain at 50, we're never going to get to any kind of parity or equality at the top. I love what Vivian's doing. But I also think that there's a real problem here, which companies have not yet fixed, because you and I, Vanessa, were told that by the time we were 50, we would get to parity, that it was all about the fact that, we entered the workforce in the same numbers as men. In the early 90s, the late 80s. So by now, I'm 50, we should be at parity in senior positions, particularly within the professions which we entered at 50-50, and we're so far away from that. And there's a hidden piece of the jigsaw, a missing piece of the jigsaw, which for me is queen-agers, and how we keep midlife women in their roles, how we actively encourage companies to consider them as an important resource, because I think too often they're not seen as the important resource that they are. But or more senior women, 68% more likely to mentor and encourage junior diverse talent. You can see that in the McKinsey research, and the best at managing complex change. And yet too often queen-agers leave and the water just closes over them and they disappear without a trace. And a lot of companies aren't even tracking this. But in a world of a talent shortage, and when we're talking about gender pay gaps and what we do to make the workforce more women friendly, holding on to those role models, those mentors, those experienced women, the ones who should be stepping into leadership, is absolutely crucial. And for too many companies, it's not on their agenda. So my book, Much More to Come, is all about how you hang on to your queenager talent, what they need. For instance, flexibility, 16 times more important for queenagers than status. And yet usually as we get more senior, we get the big office, the fancy title, and a real lack of understanding out there about who queenagers are, what they want, and what the pressures are on them within their lives. So we now go into companies and we run what we call a noon circles. What I do, I'm actually in Wales at the moment running a retreat for the women who come to my noon community, which is a kind of ongoing thing about how do you pivot, how do you live your best life at 50 plus. But there's such a collision here between people's caring responsibilities, between their sense of self-fulfillment and that sense of if you've got this much time left, how do you use that purposefully? So we also find purpose becomes incredibly important to queenagers, and autonomy and the sense that they're doing something worthwhile. But what's really interesting about those metrics is they are also what the millennials and the Gen Zs want. So my real message is if companies get it right for queenagers, they'll set themselves up for success with the younger generations. And queenagers are the canary in the coal mine when it comes to, are you getting your diversity strategy right? Because if you can hang on to your senior women, spearhead, they're these pioneering, spearheading women, then you're setting yourself up for success with the women and the men who come behind them. Because a lot of the younger men have a much more similar kinds of outlooks on what they want from their careers and the work-life balance as we women did as pioneers in the kind of male workforce. And at the Sunday Times, I was always being asked by younger men, you seem to have raised 2 kids and still be a human being and having a good job here. How have you had that conversation with the senior men? How do I ask this scary big dinosaur boss how I can leave at 5:30 to pick up my kid from nursery because my wife is also working and it's not fair that it always falls on her. So I think that the lessons that we have as senior women for the women coming up behind us and the men, both as role models and in how companies can adapt their culture to suit us, is incredibly important if we're ever going to get to the kind of equality that Vanessa is that Vivian's been talking about and that we're all searching for. And this piece about older women, the intersection of age and gender is crucial, and it's not on enough people's agendas. So if you'd like to know more about that, we do a lot of consulting in this space as Noon Consulting. My book, Much More to Come, is a Times bestseller this summer. And at Noon, we run all sorts of events, retreats, online kind of book club. We do lots of circles to dig into the women's issues, and we'd love to talk to some of you about our work and what we're up to and how we can help you.
Thank you so much, Eleanor. And just an observation, I mean, I get to see what a lot of you are doing across your networks. There's not enough that we're doing in terms of focusing on that demographic. And from your own experience, I mean, having been a senior woman myself, I didn't get time to go to the Women's Networks events when I was in corporate, but also I didn't see much there for me other than kind of, mentoring and giving back and stuff like that. So really something I want you all to think about. And obviously Eleanor is the queen in this space. What are you doing for those senior women? What are you doing to help retain them other than asking them to come and be role models? How are we supporting them in that beautiful 3rd trimester of their life? And
I think just really important to say that, Vanessa, that the stuff around menopause is helpful, but what our research
doesn't define us.
Is that, exactly. We don't want to be seen through a menopausal lens. 85% of queenagers don't want to be viewed through that lens. And the menopause is a piece of the pie chart for women at this point. It is absolutely not everything. Menopause is a bit like pregnancy. While you're in it and you're feeling a bit rubbish, it's quite important, but it doesn't last very long, and then you come out the other side of it and you feel fine. And part of the problem with the current conversation is that it's been led by the 10 to 15% of women who are having a really terrible time with menopause, when actually the majority of us, you get a bit hot, whatever, but if you get the right treatment, you just sail through it. So to see us through a kind of walking hot flush brain fog lens at this point is, I think, really detrimental to women's prospects and can really play into gendered ageism. So of course we don't want women who are having a bad time at menopause to get sacked off, and we want doctors to know how to treat them, but we don't want to be seen through a menopausal lens. This is why we talk about queenagers not walking hot flushes. And I think it's very important for companies who think, oh, we're really doing something for this cohort because we've got something on menopause. Menopause is only the very, very beginning of the story. There's so much other stuff going on, the kind of caring stuff, the collision stuff, the sense of kind of self-fulfillment, the women asking themselves, you know, is this it? Is there enough purpose here for me? And I think companies who are getting that right and are giving the women really brilliant kind of complex things to manage, or really purposeful jobs, are really reaping the benefit. And you see that in National Grid, where most of their change program now is being run by queenagers. Latest Harvard Business Review study, queenagers the best at managing complex change. So your companies can't afford not to have senior women there.
Absolutely. Obviously, Eleanor, I could talk to you all afternoon, but I'm sure we need to send these wonderful people back to their day jobs. So obviously, to everyone who's spoken to us today, you know, from Naomi to Viv to Eleanor to Harriet, such insightful kind of topics, things for you to think about. So I will let you all go. Thank you so much for joining Gender Networks. This will be recorded. We will send you the recording and the transcript, and there'll also be a summary article as well. So thank you so much for joining me, and hopefully we will see you on the other side next year. But do look out for our comms around the new WhatsApp group, the new website, you know, some of the new benefits that you can take advantage of if you stay with us for next year. But thank you ever so much. And again, thank you to Lisa as well, and the team at NatWest. You've been absolutely amazing, and keep up your incredible work. Thank you very much. Take care, everyone.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye.